Do you believe that even in the deepest silence of the forest, a life can beg for help? In the icy heart of northern Canada, where storms seem to swallow the sound of the world, something extraordinary happened, and to this day, no one can explain it exactly. It was an ordinary dawn covered by a white blanket of thick snow, when a noise cut through the void of that freezing night. A faint, hesitant sound, almost a whisper coming from the wild. A cry for help. Animal rescue stories have moved millions, but this one goes beyond compassion. It is a puppy in trouble, a lost, hungry, and injured bear who appeared in the most unlikely place. A former hunter's backyard. A defenseless creature facing the extreme danger of the frozen lands alone, with injured paws and eyes full of despair. The scenery was almost surreal. The blizzard hit the mountains. The trees creaked under the weight of the ice. And in the midst of this white and hostile immensity, the small silhouette of a bear cub appeared, staggering among the shadows, seeking shelter, or who knows, a miracle. This kind of story is not just moving. It triggers an instinct deep within us. The same thing that makes us hold our breath when we see an animal fighting for its life. The same thing that connects us with the unexpected, with the mysterious, with what is pure and brutal in nature. And that's exactly what happened that night, a collision between worlds. The savage survival instinct found the human heart in its most raw and empathetic form. A story of rescue that begins in the middle of nowhere, but spread like wildfire throughout the city, leaving everyone shocked by what came next. But what makes a bear cub approach humans? And even more, what makes a man known for hunting completely change his reaction when faced with a wild animal on the verge of collapse? The answer to this lies in details that you will still learn about, and each of them will make you see wildlife with new eyes. Puppy in Trouble is not just the name of a series of videos that touch the heart. It is a call to reflection. It is a reminder that even in the coldest landscapes, there can be heat. In the most isolated regions of the planet, where bears face hunger, ice traps, and the loss of their territories, stories like this are rare, but real. And when they happen, they transform everything, including those who witness them. Get ready to dive into an intense story, full of emotion, extreme danger, and life or death choices. Every second from now on will reveal a new fragment of this unlikely connection. The puppy didn't get there by chance. And what happened next? Well, you need to see for yourself, because when a bear in danger approaches a human, instinct is not always what wins. Sometimes it's the heart. And that's when everything changes. In the silent white expanse of Hudson Bay, in the far north of Canada, where the winds whisper ancient stories in the frozen treetops and the ground seems to breathe ice, lives Tomas. A man who, for many, is seen as a living legend, a retired hunter who traded the rush of civilization for the dangerous calm of raw nature. Tomas is not just a survivor of the cold. He is part of the territory itself, someone who learned to listen to the signs of the earth, to respect its cycles, and to honor wildlife like few still do today. The story you are about to witness does not begin with a heroic act. It starts with silence, an icy, dense, cutting silence. Early winter 2020. The last ferry had left the coast days ago. The few families that lived on the outskirts of the forest had retreated to their wooden houses, reinforcing windows, stocking firewood, and hoping that the blizzards would pass without tragedy. But Tomas always stayed. Loneliness for him was not punishment. It was refuge. And it was precisely in this solitude that he witnessed something that would change his life forever. Hudson Bay, at that time of year, is unforgiving. Temperatures plummet to 40 degrees ice with ease. The wind cuts the skin even under layers of heavy clothing. And the snow covers everything: trees, trails, footprints, even the dangers themselves. There are no reliable trails. There is no noise from cars or planes. Just the snap of frozen branches and, every now and then, the distant call of a lone crow. For many, this place is synonymous with despair. But for the Cree, the region's original people, it is sacred land, land of forest spirits, land of bears. There, bears are not just wild animals. They are symbols of strength, guardians of balance, ancestors in animal form. There are legends that tell of bears that walk like men, of encounters between hunters and bear spirits that came to teach lessons. Tomas grew up listening to these stories and learned from his elders to hunt with honor, not to waste, to be grateful for the life taken, and to recognize the signs when an animal was not just an animal, but a cry for attention from nature itself. Tomas's cabin, simple and sturdy, built with his own hands decades ago, stood near the edge of the dense forest. He lived with little: a few old tools, now rusty traps, books on animal behavior, yellowed photographs from times when hunting was his routine, no longer his livelihood. He hadn't hunted in years. His heart, scarred by cruel winters and short summers, had become softer. Over time, he began to dedicate himself to observation. He wrote down in thick notebooks the behavior of foxes, wolves, elk, and of course bears. That night, he was lighting the old wood stove when he heard the sound. An almost imperceptible noise coming from the back of the cabin. He thought it was the wind pushing snow against the wood, but there was something different. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, slow, hesitant, drawn out. He took the flashlight with the firm hand of someone who had already faced more than a dozen winters there, carefully opened the door, and saw him. A bear cub, drenched in snow, its paws red from open wounds, and its eyes. The eyes were the hardest part to look at. There was no threat in them. There was no attack instinct. There was tiredness, hunger, pain, and a kind of plea that cut deeper than the cold. Tomas froze for a moment. All his training told him to back up, close the door, and wait for the animal to move away. But something inside him prevented this gesture. Maybe it was the fact that the cub was alone, no mother around, no return footprints. Maybe it was the time of familiarity with Cree stories about messenger bears. Or maybe it was just the simple fact of seeing such a young being on the verge of death and feeling that ignoring that would be the same as denying everything he had learned about respect and connection with nature. The city of Churchill, the closest one, was more than 30 kilometers away, inaccessible at that time due to the snowfall. Tomas knew that any help would take days, and the cub had no days left. He barely had the strength to stand. He stumbled, fell, got up slowly, as if asking, just a few more hours. The hunter, now involuntary guardian, knelt slowly without saying anything. He just lowered the flashlight, letting the light illuminate the ground around him. The puppy didn't run away. He didn't growl. He just stood there, breathing hard. It was as if both man and bear had understood something that words could not explain. As the snow fell harder again, Tomas looked up at the dark sky and murmured something he had learned from the Cree, Tapwewin Kisikau. The truth is in heaven. And at that moment, maybe he was, because what came next wouldn't just be a rescue. It would be an encounter capable of shocking an entire city and moving anyone who believes that animals feel, think, and trust more than we imagine. If you want to follow everything that happened from that moment on and understand why this simple gesture completely changed the story of Tomas and the little bear, subscribe to the channel right now. Stories like this are rare, real, and profoundly transformative. Let's continue on this journey together. On that silent morning, the world seemed covered in a layer of frozen time. No birds crossed the sky. No sound came from the forest. It was as if everything there was waiting for something, or someone. Tomas, as usual, had already been awake for hours, preparing root tea and firewood for another day in the extreme isolation of the Canadian North. He had no idea that, at that exact moment, the thin line between the wild and the human world would be broken by something he would never forget. That's when he saw movement, slow, hesitant. In the distance, between the white of the accumulated snow and the dull gray of the trees, something was dragging. At first, it looked like just a block of shadow undulating against the dim morning light. But as Tomas adjusted his glasses and approached the window, his heart quickened. It wasn't a log blown by the wind. It was not an illusion caused by tiredness. It was a bear cub, A small body covered in snow, staggering, weak, completely lost, and absolutely alone. Tomas stopped, staring at the scene as if time had stopped. The cub came from the east, where the forest was denser and less traveled. There was no sign of the mother, nor any larger footprints nearby. Just those little trembling marks, as if with each step the animal had to decide between moving forward or falling. The hairs were embedded with hardened ice. The front paws were red with visible injuries, probably caused by abandoned traps, cutting branches, or just the continuous impact against the icy surface. But what really stopped Tomas was the look. Those eyes were a mirror of everything that is rawest in wildlife. Fear, exhaustion, pain, but also confidence. A silent, innocent confidence that seemed to say, "You see me, so help me." It was impossible not to feel that in my soul. It was impossible to pretend it wasn't happening. The little bear was in trouble, and he had chosen from all directions to go there. Even Tomas, as if he knew in some inexplicable way that that house hidden at the end of the world housed a heart still willing to care. He approached slowly, stumbling every now and then. Snow accumulated on his back, creating an almost frozen layer over his fine hair. Tomas watched without moving, fearing that any sudden gesture would frighten the cub. But the creature continued. One step, then another, then one more, until he finally stopped a few meters from the entrance, exhausted. His breathing was irregular, his body trembling. And yet, there was no aggression. There was no growling. There was delivery. It was as if the puppy had made the last decision he could ever make. Trust. Tomas knew that was rare, almost impossible. Bears, even cubs, are skittish, defensive, and when they are alone, fear makes them retreat in any direction away from the scent of humans. But he didn't back down. He was there, and he was clearly asking for something that no survival manual teaches how to give. Warmth, support, one last ray of hope. The old hunter slowly walked to the door. He opened it carefully, without making any noise, allowing the cold air to enter in contrast to the heat of the cabin. Outside, the cub stared at him, and that's when Tomas saw more than tired eyes, saw history, saw memory. He saw the memory of so many other rescues, of animals in danger, of lives saved by minutes of compassion. The little bear no longer looked like a wild animal at that moment. He was a living question asked by nature to man. And now, what are you going to do? Tomas took a step forward. His body shook less from the cold and more from the impact of the moment. He hadn't prepared for this. There was no plan. Just instinct. An instinct that was born not from hunting, but from shared survival. He remembered the words of Tulimak, the Cree elder who had once told him, "When a bear comes looking for you, he doesn't want what you have. He wants what you feel." And there he was, feeling everything at once. The puppy, despite the obvious pain, raised its head a little. His snout twitched. His eyes remained fixed on Tomas, and without making a sound, he fell sideways into the snow, surrendered. It was one of the heaviest moments in Tomas's life. Because in that gesture, there was something even stronger than despair. There was trust. A trust so pure it hurt. As if that little being said with its body, "I tried. I came. Now it's up to you." And it was. Because at that moment, Tomas understood that he couldn't ignore it. That I couldn't close the door and wait for nature to take its course. This wasn't just any visit. It was a calling. A cry for help that no one else would hear. And at that moment, in the midst of the solitude of the Arctic, only he could respond. And if you, like Tomas, feel that something inside you has awakened with this story, if this moment has touched your heart in some way, I invite you to subscribe to the channel right now. This is where you will find real, intense, and transformative stories about compassion, survival, and the incredible bond between humans and animals. Let's find out together what happened next, because this story is far from over. Tomas remained motionless for long seconds, with the door ajar, the wood creaking slightly under the pressure of the freezing wind. The cub was still there, lying in the snow, its fur stiffened by the extreme cold. its fragile body panting in short, painful breaths. That image never left his eyes. It was a silent picture of urgency and vulnerability. And at the same time, it was as if time was frozen around him, demanding an immediate response from the man who had spent his entire life listening to the rules of the forest. Rules that said, never feed a wild bear, never approach a puppy alone, never intervene. But what about when that never appears in front of you in the form of desperate eyes, begging not for food, but for a second chance? What if what stands before you is no longer just a wild animal, but a life on the brink of ending? These were the questions that pulsed through Tomas's head as his heart raced, not out of fear, but out of a kind of emotion he hadn't felt in years. An emotion that came from deep within his soul, from before he became a hunter, before he learned to harden his heart to survive in that merciless environment. The moral dilemma was tearing him up inside. The forest taught us to respect the natural cycle of life. He had learned from the Cree that everything has its time, that death is part of it, that human interference can unbalance more than it helps. But he had also learned silently over the years that nature doesn't always manage on its own, that sometimes life reaches out to compassion as a last resort, and that's what he saw in that puppy, a choice, a request, a test. He thought about the consequences. A bear cub saved by humans could once again depend on them. It could grow without fear, without the natural instincts that guarantee its survival. Would that be fair? Would it be right to change the course of wild instinct? What if Mom was still around? What if it was just a momentary separation, and he was about to interfere with a reunion that would happen naturally? Doubts piled up, like snow on the cabin windows. But along with them, another feeling grew inside him, one that could not be explained logically, one that came from the eyes of that motionless puppy. It was as if he said, "I didn't come by chance." Tomas took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on that small creature. No manual, no traditional teaching, no experienced hunter had prepared him for that moment. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about right or wrong. It was about feeling. And what he felt was clear. This wasn't just an animal in danger. It was a life about to go out, and he was the only flame around. He retreated into the cabin, grabbed a thick woolen blanket, the only one he no longer slept in, and headed back to the door. Each step was a break with everything that had been up to that point. I was crossing an invisible line, from hunter to caretaker, from wildlife observer to part of history. He knelt in front of the cub, keeping his eyes down, respecting the space, respecting the fear. He placed the blanket over the snow, slowly spreading it, creating a barrier between the frozen ground and that small injured body. Didn't touch him, just waited. The cub watched him, too weak to react, but strong enough to realize something was different. A human who didn't scream, which didn't threaten, that didn't run. A human standing still, silent, offering warmth. It was at that moment that Tomas saw the impossible happen. The puppy, with effort, crawled a few centimeters and placed his front paw against the fabric of the blanket. It stayed there, no running away, without resisting. And in that gesture, more than in any other, Tomas understood. He had made the right choice, even against all the rules. Even against what books, men, logic said. He had answered life's call, and life, wild as it was, had accepted. Outside, the blizzard started again. The wind howled as if trying to erase what was happening. But inside the cabin, something new was born, still fragile, still surrounded by uncertainty, but pulsing. And it was just the beginning. If this part of the story has already touched your heart, comment below the word strength, so I know that you also believe that empathy can change destinies, even when everything seems lost. Let's stay together, because what comes next is even more intense. The cold cut Tomas's face like invisible razors, but he barely felt it. Inside, what was freezing now was the weight of responsibility that rested in his trembling hands. A piece of dried fish on the left, a thick woolen blanket on the right. With slow, calculated steps he approached. With every inch gained in the thick snow, The muffled sound of his boots was swallowed by the absolute silence of the surrounding forest. The puppy remained motionless, but its eyes followed the movement with the intensity of someone who was still fighting, even if the fight already seemed lost. Tomas knew this was the breaking point. The decision that separates the man who watches what happens from the man who chooses to act. The old hunter, now with a look full of compassion, slowly lowered himself, respecting the animal's space. He didn't extend his hand. He didn't make any sudden gestures. He just placed the blanket over the snow, folding it into a shape that could wrap around the small body without scaring it. Next to it, he left the dried fish. The salty smell of the food spread into the cold air, carried by the wind to the bear's cold nose. For seconds that seemed like an eternity. Nothing happened. The puppy remained still, eyes fixed, breathing still irregular. Tomas held his breath, waiting, hoping. And then, with effort, as if moved only by hope, the cub stretched its neck, sniffing at the fish. He dragged himself a little, his muscles trembling, and managed to reach the food with his mouth. The sound of teeth tearing through flesh was the first real noise of that frozen morning. A sound that seemed simple, but, to Tomas, sounded like a promise. He wants to live. Seeing that was enough. That was all he needed to act with conviction. No longer driven by doubt, but by the certainty that that puppy still had a chance, and that he would be responsible for keeping it alive. With all the care in the world, Tomas watched until the puppy finished eating, without trying to touch him, without invading his space. Only then, with slow gestures, did he spread the blanket again, bringing it closer to the small body, until it partially covered it. The bear didn't resist, it was allowed to warm up. A wisp of steam rose from his wet body, a contrast to the sharp morning air. Knowing that the makeshift shelter wouldn't last long, Tomas looked up at his cabin. I couldn't bring him inside, it was dangerous, insecure, but I also couldn't leave him there exposed. I needed a middle ground. And then he remembered something he had built years ago. An old hunting lodge, made of logs and reindeer skins, just a few meters from the house. Used to store supplies during months of deployment, it was now empty. It was small, protected from the wind and warmed by the heat of the frozen earth beneath the straw. A modest place, but at that moment it could mean the difference between life and death. Tomas moved quickly. He looked for a second blanket, more skins, dry sticks. He set up a small fire inside the shelter, protected by rocks. He lit it carefully. The heat was still weak but real. A heat that could regenerate. Then, with patience and the strength of the years that had hardened his muscles, he returned to the cub. The snow was falling more intensely now. The weather was getting tighter. He wrapped the animal as best he could, created a base under it with the folded blanket, and then, with his strong arms, lifted it off the ground. The cub's body was surprisingly light, too light to be healthy, but he was still breathing. He still resisted. He carried him to the shelter. Each step seemed longer than the last. The weight in your arms, the wind against your face, the tension of dealing with a wild being. All of this required absolute focus. But Tomas didn't hesitate. When he arrived, he laid the cub on the dry skin close to the heat of the small flame. He covered it, placed more fish beside it, and stood back, watching. The cub was shaking, but it was no longer a panicked tremor. It was the body trying to adapt to what it felt. Safety. That small structure of wood, canvas, and reindeer skin had become, there, in the heart of an inhospitable forest, the only real refuge for that animal on the verge of death. And Tomas, who had seen many endings, understood that this was not the end. It was the beginning of something rare, something that perhaps only those who live far from the world know how to recognize. He spent the rest of the day monitoring from afar. The cub slept for long periods, but when he woke up, he ate little by little, moved his neck, or just looked around with heavy but lively eyes. Tomas kept his distance, but his heart was already there inside the shelter. And even though he knew that every gesture could be judged, that he was disobeying ancient rules about the coexistence between man and wild animal, he didn't back down. No more. Because there, before him, was a life he chose to trust. and he chose not to betray that trust. If you've made it this far, I want to make you a simple but important invitation. Comment the word treatment down here. Yes, it heals. Because that's what this story is about. Healing invisible wounds, restoring bonds between humans and animals, remembering that there is still a place for compassion in this wild world. And stay with me, because what's coming next will give you goosebumps. It didn't take long for the story to stop being just an intimate moment between a lonely man and a bear cub in trouble. What had happened in that remote clearing, between the old reindeer hide shelter and Tomas's heart, had escaped the trees and reached the ears of the nearest community. Iqaluit, the icy city just over 20 miles away where the Cree and other hardy residents of the far north live, began to murmur. The news traveled like the wind that cuts through the tundra, first in whispers, then in increasingly louder voices. Tomas, the reclusive hunter, the one who had disappeared to the edges of the forest for years to live with his own thoughts and his own ghosts, was now the center of a controversy that divided an entire community. And not because he killed something, as many once expected of him, but for saving. And precisely because of this, opinions clashed like thawing ice sheets. Some were outraged. "It's dangerous," they said. "This bear will grow up thinking that humans are allies. And when it gets too big, who will pay the price?" Others, more attached to ancient traditions, said that Tomas was disrespecting natural cycles, intervening where he shouldn't have. For them, the cub's death, although painful, was part of the forest's balance. Interfering with this was breaking with what our ancestors taught, and that in that culture was not just wrong. It was sacred. There were those who called it madness. He's old. He's losing his mind. He's lived alone for years. He talks to trees. Now he thinks he's some kind of shaman. The conversations spread across local radio stations, through small grocery stores in the city, through social networks that, even though they were limited in that isolated region, never let a case like this pass without becoming a comment. The tone was serious, warning. Most didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. The forest was not a place for sentimentality. It was a place for survival. What about a man who welcomes a predator? This went beyond any logic, any rule, any common sense. But, like every story that affects people's emotions, there was also another side. Those who saw beyond the surface. Those who stood in front of the fireplace, in silence, imagining what Tomas saw in that puppy's eyes. Those who remembered the legends, passed down from generation to generation, that talked about messenger bears, creatures that appeared when something in the world needed to be fixed. And among these, one did not hear criticism, but respect. A silent bow to a man who had the courage to do what many would not do. Extend his hand without expecting anything in return. "It was a sign," said an elderly woman, one of those who still carried Cree traditions with pride. Bears appear to those who carry regret in their hearts. He was chosen to balance something, perhaps something only he knows what it is. These words, spoken on community radio one morning, resonated, and it didn't take long for others to begin to see the situation in more depth. Still, the negative bias predominated. The fear, the distrust, the judgment. After all, it was easier to label Tomas an eccentric old man than to understand what really happened inside that snow-covered shelter. Few knew that he spent his nights awake, listening to the baby's weak breathing, feeding him warm broth made from fish and boiled roots, and removing, with careful gestures, any shadow of fear that still hovered in the creature's eyes. Social tension increased. Some people demanded that the environmental guard intervene. They wanted the animal removed from there and taken to a rehabilitation center. But the answer was always the same. The roads were blocked. The blizzard isolated the region. Tomas was alone, not by choice but by force of geography and time. And in that forced isolation, he was the one who decided. Each new day that passed increased the pressure. And even with the distance, Tomas felt it. He felt the weight of the voices, the accusations, the sidelong looks that he already imagined he would receive when, one day, he returned to the city. But even so, he didn't back down. Because every time he added more wood to the small fire in the shelter, and saw the puppy sleeping peacefully, he knew that there was something there that no external judgment could erase. The truth of a gesture. And that's why this story remains so powerful. Because she talks about choices that aren't always popular, but that carry a rare kind of courage. The courage to go against the current, to take care when the world tells you to turn your back, to protect when they say it's better to let it die. And that, as controversial as it may seem, is what makes this story even more real, more human, more alive. If this part of the journey touched your heart in some way, if you felt this tension, this division, this weight of a decision that goes against everything expected, then leave your like here now. It shows me that you are with me in this, that you are feeling this story just like I am. And get ready, because what comes next will shake you even more. The third night arrived like a heavy curtain over the white immensity. The blizzard began late in the afternoon, first with small, scattered flakes, then with gusts that seemed to come from all sides, as if the wind itself was furious with something it couldn't name. Inside the small wooden cabin, Tomas kept the fireplace burning and the rifle propped behind the door. Not out of desire, but out of precaution. He knew well how the forest behaved on nights like this. And he knew that, amid the icy chaos, it wasn't just snow that was lurking around. On the other side of the fogged window, visibility was almost nil. The wind whipped through the trees, tearing off dry branches, sending ice against the cabin walls. Everything clicked. It creaked. I shuddered. Tomas, attentive, couldn't relax. The puppy, sheltered in the improvised structure a few meters from the house, slept curled up among the furs. He had gained a little more strength since the first night, and was already starting to try to stand up more firmly. But he was still far from defending himself alone. That's why, when the howling wind gave way to something different, a low shuffling sound coming from behind the shelter, Tomas's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind. It was a denser, more rhythmic sound. Steps, heavy, deep. Something or someone was walking out there, and it wasn't small. He stood up, his body stiff. He took the flashlight, pulled on his thick leather coat, locked the door from the inside, and turned off the lights in the cabin. Everything was now silence and waiting. His eyes tried to pierce the darkness through the small side window, but what he saw was only the movement of shadows, sometimes denser, sometimes more tenuous, as if something large was circling around. For a second, he thought the worst. What if it was the mother? What if, after days, she had finally found the cub? At first, this idea brought hope, but immediately instinct spoke louder. If it were the mother and she felt threatened by the man's presence, the reaction could be fatal. For him, or even for the puppy himself, he decided not to leave. Not yet. I needed to observe, understand, wait. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. The sound continued there, closer and closer to the shelter where the cub was resting. There were scratches on the wood, slow but firm movements. Tomas was holding the flashlight tightly. His entire body was on alert. And then came the sound that froze everything. A low, guttural, deep growl. It was definitely not a puppy. She wasn't a mother. It was another bear, an adult, and it was right there. The sound stopped. There was a sudden silence, the kind of silence that precedes something unpredictable. The snow continued to fall in thick blocks, muffling every step, every movement. But even with his limited senses, Tomas knew he wasn't alone. Something watched. Something was moving, lurking. When he finally decided to turn on the flashlight and look through the crack in the side of the cabin, the beam of light cut through the darkness and met, for a fraction of a second, the eyes of an adult bear. The eyes were fixed on the shelter. Not on him. In the shelter. A few meters away. Tomas held his breath. The bear was sniffing. I tried to understand what was inside there, and by his posture, by the way he walked in circles, he seemed curious, but tense. It was possible that he had been attracted by the smell of food, or perhaps by the scent of the puppy itself. And that changed everything. If he saw him as a threat, he might attack. If it saw it as prey, it might invade. And at that moment, Tomas realized how much his decision had created a bond not only between him and that puppy, but between him and all the wild instinct around him. He was now part of the chain. It was in the equation. He thought quickly, I couldn't shoot. This would scare the puppy, it could attract others. Furthermore, I still believed that violence was not the way forward. He took a deep breath, turned on the second flashlight, and taking cover behind the porch structure, pointed the beam directly at the bear. He shouted loudly, not to provoke, but to break the cycle. The sound echoed. The bear turned its head, surprised by the human's presence. Their eyes met again. For seconds, that felt like years. And then, the bear retreated. It didn't run, he just walked away. Slow, cautious, as if saying, that's not my story. And he disappeared among the trees, swallowed by darkness. Tomas stood there, his chest heaving, hands still shaking. The wind was still howling, but now there was a new kind of silence. The silence of survival, of resistance, of what almost happened, but didn't. And at that moment, with the beam of light still trembling in the air, he turned his face towards the shelter and saw, through the cracks in the structure, two small round eyes watching from within. The cub was awake. He had witnessed everything, and even without understanding the details, he seemed to understand. It was safe. For one more night I was safe. If this moment has captured you so far, if you felt this suspense in your chest just like I felt writing and narrating this, then leave your like now. This really helps spread this story and shows me that you are with me on this journey. And take a deep breath, because what's about to happen will still surprise a lot of people. The dawn continued, thick, dense as the blizzard itself that continued to fall mercilessly on Hudson Bay. The old hunter, still panting, held the lantern with fingers stiff from the cold and shock. Outside, the shape of the adult bear had disappeared into the shadows of the forest. But what Tomas didn't know, still stuck in the previous moment, was that it wasn't just his presence that had warded off the danger. Something else had happened. Something that not even he, with all his years of experience in nature, could explain logically. That's when, seconds after the adult bear disappeared into the darkness, the sound happened. Low, shaved, but undeniably real, coming from inside the shelter. A guttural sound, a low moan, but clean, of course, not out of fear, not from pain. It was a calling. The cub had made that sound. With an almost superhuman effort given his weakened condition, he had raised his neck, directed his head out of the shelter and vocalized. A sound that cut through the frozen night air like an invisible arrow. Tomas listened, and immediately looked back. There, among the pines, the adult bear stood, still visible for a second in the faint moonlight. His eyes turned toward the sound. The body is paralyzed. He recognized it. Somehow he recognized that sound. And then slowly, without running, without threatening, he just turned and walked away. It disappeared, as if he understood, as if he had respected it. The old hunter who had seen and heard unbelievable things in decades of living in that wilderness was static. That wasn't normal. It wasn't common, it was magical. A type of communication that defied everything he knew, because what was in that sound wasn't just instinct. It was something more, an invisible force, a code between species, an ancestral memory perhaps which said, here he is protected. Tomas walked to the shelter carefully. The wind was already beginning to lose strength, and the snow was now falling in large, soft flakes, as if the forest itself had exhaled relief. The light from the flashlight revealed the small body of the cub still lying on the fur, with its breathing more controlled, its eyes vivid. The animal stared at him, and for a split second Tomas had the strange sensation that they were sharing something more than space and time. There was understanding. There was gratitude, a silent link between a being who fought to live and another who, by saving him, rediscovered his own humanity. The next morning brought clear skies for the first time in days, and with the sun beating down on the snowy fields, everything seemed new. Tomas, his clothes still soaked from the night before, went out to get more firewood and checked the shelter. When he arrived, he found the puppy standing upright. Trembling, it's true, still fragile, but standing. The little bear lifted his nose into the air, smelling the wind, feeling the warmth of the sunlight on his skin for the first time since arriving in that shelter. Tomas held his breath, watching in silence. It was like watching the rebirth of a creature who had overcome death with courage and a little help. The following days passed lighter. The cub began to feed more frequently. Tomas improvised a larger space inside the shelter, opening part of the side to allow the animal to move around. For the first time, he saw him play, sticking his nose in the soft snow, tripping over his own paws, as if testing the limits of his body that was once again obeying. The sound of their clumsy paws in the snow was music, a reminder that, even in the most inhospitable scenario, life finds ways to flourish. And the forest seemed to know. The surrounding sounds changed. The crows have returned. The foxes began to circle the surroundings, as if the place, previously in tense silence, now pulsed at a new frequency. And of course, the city listened too. In Iqaluit, rumors turned into reports. Someone at the radio station said that the bear had been seen, and that it had left after hearing the cub's call. This spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Tomas was no longer just the man who had taken in a wild animal. He was the man who had witnessed something inexplicable. The man who lived an episode that only indigenous legends had dared to tell. And public opinion, little by little, began to change. Those who previously screamed for intervention now fell silent. Others, more sensitive, began to repeat the old woman's words. Maybe this bear was sent. Community radio aired the case again, and this time in a respectful tone. Tomas, of course, did not comment, never needed it, because everything he had to say was there, in that shelter of wood, skin, and silence, in that puppy that now walked more firmly, in that forest that breathed a little lighter. If this moment moved you as it moved me when I told you about it, leave your like here now. It helps me understand that you are feeling this story with me. And hold on tight, because what comes next will touch your heart even deeper. The snow began to melt slowly, as if even she knew that this cycle was about to end. The days had lengthened, and the brightness of the pale blue sky had replaced the endless gray of the last few weeks. The fur shelter, which for so long had been a refuge, a cocoon, and sometimes even a temple, now sheltered only the echo of the short, firm steps of a cub that no longer looked the same. He was no longer that being bent by pain, injuries, and fear. Now he walked with a new lightness, with his eyes more awake and his chest a little fuller. And Tomas, well, Tomas wasn't the same either. Every morning, while feeding the cub freshly cooked fish, mixed with roots heated in the iron cauldron, he observed the way that little being interacted with the world. Every gesture, every curious glance, every little attempt to run and slip in the snow, everything was a constant reminder that life, when embraced with care, has an almost supernatural strength. The cub had become a symbol of something greater, of the resilience of nature, of the importance of empathy, of the invisible power that exists when two species decide to trust each other. Tomas, who had spent years in silence, found himself talking. He spoke to the bear. He called him Little Warrior. He told old Cree stories, recited low prayers he remembered from his childhood. And the bear, as if he understood every word, looked him in the eyes. There was something there, something that went beyond language. A communication made of silence, presence, and respect, until the day came. The one where Tomas woke up with a slight tightness in his chest. The same one he had felt the first time he saw the puppy thrown in the snow. But now, it was different. It was a calling. He knew it was time to let him go. Not because I wanted to, but because it was right. Because that bear was not born to live among reindeer skins and wooden walls. He was born to run wild among the pines, to smell the wind, to swim in icy rivers and find his place among his people. Then calmly, Tomas prepared a small leather backpack. He put some food in it, as if it would make a difference. But deep down, it was more of a symbolic gesture, like a mother preparing her child's lunch on the first day of school. He placed the puppy on an improvised sled, covered him with the old blanket that had warmed him on the coldest nights, and left. The forest was silent, but it was not the silence of fear. It was a respectful, almost solemn silence, as if all of nature was watching that moment. The trail was familiar, but that morning it seemed to have taken on another dimension. The tree branches formed arches, the footprints left along the path were gently erased by the wind, and Tomas's every step was guided by something he himself could not name. When they reached the clearing, Tomas stopped. It was a wide space, surrounded by tall trees, where the sunlight fell directly on the ground, making the snow shine as if it were made of diamonds. He slowly released the sled's ties. The cub, already standing, sniffed the air. His eyes shone as he felt freedom so close, and then he looked at Tomas one last time. It was just a second, but within that second, there was everything. The memory of the rescue, the days of pain, the hot nights, fear overcome, wordless affection. And then he ran. First slowly, as if testing his own strength. Then, on the run. Paws sinking into the snow, fur blowing in the wind. Eyes fixed on some distant place. Perhaps a promise. Perhaps just the call of the forest. He crossed the clearing and disappeared into the trees, without looking back. And I didn't need to look. Tomas stood there. The chest is heavy and light at the same time. I felt like I had given something back to the world, something that was never yours. That moment, accompanied only by the soft sound of the wind and the steady beat of his own heart, was the consecration of everything he had experienced in the last few weeks. He was no longer a hunter. The weapons hanging on the cabin wall were now just reminders of an earlier time. What he had become now was something else, a guardian, a man who heard the call of the unexpected and responded with humanity. And the forest? She also looked different. The sound of the branches, the light song of the crows, the smell of the earth mixed with the snow. Everything seemed more alive, as if he recognized in Tomas no longer a predator, but an ally. If this moment moved you as much as it moved me, if for some reason you felt your heart beat differently when imagining the puppy returning to nature, then I want to ask you one simple thing. Share this emotion by clicking like right now. This helps bring this story to more people who, like you, believe that every life matters, and that even the most unexpected connections can transform destinies. We're not finished yet. What comes next will still surprise you. Sometimes life surprises us with encounters that weren't in the plan, but that transform everything. A bear cub lost in the cold, a man marked by silence, and a forest that witnessed something rare, the courage to care, even when the whole world said otherwise. This is not just a story about a rescue. It's about the power of empathy, about how, even in the coldest corners of the earth, there is still room for human warmth, about how the connection between such different species can remind us of what we often forget, that each life has value, and that choosing to help is an act of profound humanity. And if you've come this far, if you felt your chest tighten, your eyes fill, or a timid hope rekindle within you, then this is your story too. Because deep down, we're all just trying to find a little light in the cold, aren't we? Sometimes we are the baby. Other times, we are Tomas. But the important thing is to remember that always there is room for compassion. There is always time to start over. Did you feel something special with this video, just like I felt telling this story? So come be part of our community. Here we believe that stories like these have the power to warm the world, one soul at a time. Click sign up now, because in the next video there is another real, deep, and transformative story waiting for you. And it is already appearing on your screen. And before you go, tell me here in the comments, how did this story move you? Leave just one word, one sentence, whatever comes from the heart. I will read everything with care, and who knows, your message will inspire someone who also needs to believe again. See you in the next chapter. Until then, take care, feel, and never underestimate the power of a gesture of kindness. He can change someone's destiny, or a little bear in trouble.